Hi and welcome back. In this video I'm going to have a look at types of fear and anxiety. But before I do, I just want to do a summary of the last session because it appertains to this session and kind of this session leads on quite nicely from the last session. So if you remember from the last session, this is an image of half of our brain, and that our brain developed in three chunks. First there was the reptilian brain that we kind of share with ancestors like sharks and other reptiles, crocodiles and the dinosaurs, and that's about all they had. Then the mammals came along and we had the mammalian brain, or the limbic system, which is the emotional brain, and in particular the development of the amygdala, whereby it would develop three responses to fear: the flight response, run away, and that's where we get the avoidance from; the freeze response, that's where we get that kind of mind blank feeling where we can't think straight; and the flight and the fight feeling, where we get irritable or frustrated. And that there's right at the new cortex, the neocortex, that has developed in the last 50 million years, and in particular in the last 195,000 years in humans, and the development of the area at the front of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, that houses things like the ability to plan and imagination and things like that, and the fact that they're in conflict in a way with the amygdala, in as much as the amygdala only thinks that anything that comes into it is happening right here, right now, because when it grew up all those years ago, none of the neocortex existed. But the neocortex, and the prefrontal lobe in particular, can think about things that are in the future and haven't happened yet, and probably won't happen. So we can imagine disasters, and we can imagine winning the lottery, for example, and the chances of that happening is pretty small, 14 million to 1 I think at the last count. But just thinking about those things evokes an emotion, because the emotional part of the brain activates as if it's really happening, and it makes the assumption that it is really happening. So let's go on and have a look at types of fear. Now, what you're going to see here is based on some research that I conducted when I was at Cranfield University in about 2005-2006. Now what I did was, there was a group of us, we had 245 people from Australia, Japan and the UK keep anxiety diaries for 3 months. So every time that they got anxious, we asked them to note it down, and then we started to analyse the diaries. And what we discovered was there was largely two types of fear. There's what we call episodic fear, and there's anticipatory fear. Now what episodic fear means is it's kind of our memories and emotions are encoded. So what we get are the so if you imagine some, I don't know, one of the first memories that you've got, just think about one of the very first memories that you've got, and as you go back, what you'll probably find is that that memory will have some emotion encoded in it. It'll be a time that you got trapped in a car or fell off your bike or something like that. So episodic memories are memories from the past that have the emotion encoded with that memory. So this is one type of fear we have that's actually based on something that has really happened to us in the past. And that's quite important. It has to have happened to us in the past. The second type, the anticipatory type of anxiety, is what we call what we think the future might be. It's not what the future is going to be, because nobody knows. It's our imagination creating what we think might happen in the future. So if you think about winning the lottery, for example, that brings about nice feelings. If you think about something in the future that's not nice, running out of money, for example, we start to get anxiety. And what you'll notice about anticipatory fears is that you've probably had them all of your life. So some of the common ones, for example, are believing that there's something under the bed. Now, we'll come back to this in a little while, but and you'll have noticed this, you've dishabituated that one, so you no longer believe that there's something living under the bed that will grab your ankles as you come out and you're frightened to get out of bed as such. So you've actually dishabituated that anticipatory fear. So when we started to count up how much of people's daily fears are actually based on real events that have happened to them in the past, or are anticipatory in as much as they haven't happened yet, but they're thinking about it, that it might happen, or even that it's not possible to happen, but they're just thinking about it and it's creating that anxiety. Let's have a look at what we've got. What we find is that 10% is episodic. So 10% of our daily anxieties are episodic, and about 90% are anticipatory. Now, one of the most recent findings is that we tend to live, in our heads anyway, roughly about 70% of our time, just on a day-to-day basis, not in terms of anxiety, planning and thinking about the future rather than being in the here and now, or roughly about 20% of our time thinking about the past. So we spend very little time just being in the here and now. And then what we discovered when we had a look and we analysed the diaries a bit further, that there are two types of anticipatory fear. And they split down into these two types: evidence-based anticipatory fear and imagination-based. Now, the difference is, so with evidence-based, there would be some evidence in the scenario to suggest that something might actually happen in the nearish future. And imagination-based means that there's no evidence in the scenario to suggest that anything's going to happen. So let me give you an example of these two. So imagine you're walking down a darkened street at night. There's one light showing and it's dark and you're on your own. Now, if round the corner a group of youths walk and they face you off and they look a bit like this, and then you start to get anxious. Now, I would say this is anticipatory fear, because you don't know what they're going to do. They may just walk straight past you. However, there is evidence in the scenario to suggest that something bad is going to happen. So right at this moment, having anticipatory fear would be considered to be evidence-based. If, however, you were walking down the street and there was no one around and nothing happened and you were anxious and you started to worry about somebody coming out of an alley or something like that, but there was no evidence in the scenario to suggest that that was going to happen, we would then term that as imagination-based anticipatory fear. So let's just have a look at the proportions of these. And what we find here is that about 15% of imagination-based and about 15% of anticipatory fears are actually evidence-based. There's some evidence in the scenario to suggest that something bad might happen, and a whopping 85% is actually imagination-based. There's no evidence in the scenario to suggest anything might happen. So I'll just give you an example of another example of imagination-based. So you're working away and the boss wants to see you, and your mind immediately leaps to, oh, what have I done? Am I going to get told off? Even though there's no evidence that anything's happened. So on the walk to the boss's office, you're running through all the scenarios of the things that might have gone wrong or that you might have done wrong. That is imagination-based. Particularly what you'll probably find is you get there and he just wants to give you some work to do or ask you a question, and it's quite benign. And that's a really good example of imagination-based anticipatory fears. And the vast majority of fears are anticipatory, and the vast majority of anticipatory fears are evidence-based, are imagination-based, sorry. And this gives us the acronym of false evidence appearing real. I just want you to think about that for a moment. So I've got some homework for you, and I want you to notice which type your anxieties are. I want you to notice whether they're really episodic or anticipatory, and if they're anticipatory, I want you to notice whether it's evidence-based or imagination-based. Now, a word of warning here. If you have a fear of flying, for example, and you think that it's episodic because something happened in the past. Let me just tell you a little story. When I was doing this research with the diaries, we had a fair amount, probably between kind of 8 to 10% of people who said that they had a fear of flying. Now, when we asked them why, what we discovered was the vast majority of those people, about 80 to 90%, said that it was because of a bad incident whilst they were flying. It was either a bad landing or it was bad air turbulence. Now, as it happened, when I was at Cranfield University, my office was right next door to the Human Factors Group. Now, the Human Factors Group are a group of psychologists who train all the air crash investigators in the world. Now, they've got a database of every incident on every aeroplane. All the data is recorded, and they keep this database for their purposes and certainly for training air crash investigators. I was able to track down a fair significance, about 60% of the flights that these people had said where the incident had occurred. And what we discovered was that it just wasn't true. Only about 3% of the people who said that they'd suffered from bad air turbulence or a bad landing had actually been involved in an incident. Now, what this is an example of a post-event rationalization. So we have an anxiety. Our neocortex says there must be a reason for it. It starts to search for a reason. If it can find one, it'll give it. If it can't find one, it'll make it up. So what I want you to do is be really honest with yourself and work out whether your anxieties are episodic or anticipatory. And if they're anticipatory, whether they're evidence-based or imagination-based. Because this is really going to help you. Anyway, I'll see you in the next video. Take care.